Hi, welcome to the mini lecture on battered women syndrome combined with the sexual assault unit as well. Um, so I always go back and forth on should I change kind of this lecture to reflect the more modern language, which is intimate partner violence. And that's what you'd find in the literature. If you're looking for newer research on domestic violence, you're going to see intimate partner violence be highlighted. And I contemplate, like, do I switch it or do I keep it with kind of this old school language? And I've kept it with the old school language. So I do think that the history is important. And why do we not actually talk much about BWS or battered women syndrome anymore? I think recognizing kind of where the downfalls in this lie is valuable. So starting the starting point, I guess, for battered women syndrome was in 1979. It was also when the phrase was, or the term was coined. But in this particular trial, there was an appeal. So you can see in the first trial, there's no expert testimony allowed, and ultimately the defendant, who was a female who murdered her husband, got a second-degree murder conviction. Goes through the appeal process. During the appeal process, ultimately, um, expert testimony was not allowed to the jury. However, the judge did ask to be, consulted. Again, we've talked about the amicus briefs previously, and judge hears it and decides, okay, well, the jury ultimately still convicted her of this, but because I now better understand what battered women for that time in 1979, what that means, granted a much more lenient sentence. So this is the first case in which battered women syndrome was actually used. And again, it wasn't necessarily a defense because it was still too new, but it altered the case to some degree. Later on, it would become a defense, which people have tried and ultimately you'll see not very successful. So it's important to note a syndrome versus a mental disorder. And this is one of the big downfalls of battered women syndrome. And again, why we don't see it used that much at all. I can't think of the last time I've seen this used as a defense. Excuse me. So a syndrome, cluster related symptoms that lead to significant dysfunction in performance of normal activities. And so anytime you see the word syndrome, it's going to relate to this, that there's multiple symptoms happening. A mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance that reflects dysfunction. And this is from the APA, which stands for the American Psychological Association. So all mental disorders are syndromes, but the difference between a mental disorder and a syndrome is the clinical significance, right? That a mental disorder has been identified in a clinical setting as being problematic. If it doesn't get to that point, it will never get to the label of mental disorder. And that plays a really big role when we talk about how courts perceive things, because syndromes typically are not introduced into what's known as the DSM, stands for the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual. It is what clinicians use to diagnose patients. So if it's not in that book, the likelihood that any type of syndrome is going to make it into the courtroom is extremely low, because an expert witness is really going to be a psychologist who is very familiar with the DSM and what's in there. So it's kind of this catch 22 that if it doesn't get into the DSM, it's not taught to new clinicians, which then means if you're trying to use it in court, most clinicians won't know what it is because they've never taught about it, and so on and so forth. So, two most controversial and prominent legal syndromes, and again, we'll talk about both of these: battered women syndrome, behavior of women abused by partner, and rape trauma syndrome, how women respond to the trauma of rape. Both these syndromes are sex specific, meaning that it is looking at a woman as a victim and how that works. And obviously, men can be the victims of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Men can also be the victims of sexual assault. In both these, I will certainly make allusions to that. But when we look at the research, most of it is done with female victims. And it's not because the research wants to ignore male victims, but if people are researching these topics, you're typically researching what is most prominent. And we do see women as victims of both intimate partner violence and sexual assault at much higher rates than what we do men. So, um, back in 1979, when battered women syndrome, and I think 1983, 84, for the rape trauma syndrome, it was not talked about. So the idea that a male was a victim of either one of these things was just not in the public eye. It was certainly happening back in those days, but it was not common knowledge. So neither one of the syndromes is in the DSM-5, which is the newest version. The DSM gets updated roughly about every 10 years. But new change um, includes explicit inclusion of sexual violence as constituting a traumatic event, which again, we'll talk a little bit about that coming up. So when we look at US history, and we'll go even further back when we get to rape, but again, it's important to understand, where do these things come from? Like, where do laws come from? How has society defined that this is okay and this isn't okay? And we need to understand that if we're interested in applying law. So until the 19th century, so 1800s, women were treated as property. And again, this was US, this was England, this was France, Germany. It was just kind of the common thing. um, it's joked about kind of in modern culture about, a woman yielding a certain take home for their parents for marriage. But that was absolutely true, that women would be traded off for, livestock, or whatever it happens to be. So when we look at that, 200 years, it's not super long. And so most of the laws that we see that have to do with violence against women, it's been tweaking the old school laws. And you can still find some really outdated stuff if you dig through different state laws, that they just never actually updated what was in the books for both intimate partner violence and sexual assault as we know them today. So just some statistics. Whenever we look at statistics for intimate partner violence or sexual assault, is important to note that they are estimates. And this is because we recognize that not everybody reports that they are a victim of this. And so we have fancy statistical algorithms that we will put through that says, if these are the known causes and based upon, all of these other factors, we're going to estimate that it's this. So that's why you will see, depending on what source you look at, a range and all this stuff. And so just want you to know that while I'll be giving you different statistics, it's important to note that the accuracy of them needs to be brought into question. They could be underestimating, they could be overestimating, but they are in fact an estimate. So the idea of 1 in 5 women will be assaulted by a partner, 1 in 14 men likely to suffer abuse as well. Again, it's not saying that if you have 5 women, one of them is a victim of abuse. What it means, how I always think of the statistics here, is that if you are a female, you have a 20% chance of being in an abusive relationship at some point in your life. If you are a man, you have, trying to do the quick math, I don't know, about 7%, give or take. 7% chance of being in some kind of abusive relationship in your life. So again, it's not saying you take 14 men and you say, all right, one of you is suffering abuse in a relationship. Which one is it? It's not that. Statistics doesn't work that way. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. Men much more likely to kill female partners. Doesn't matter if there's a history of abuse or not. We just see this time and time again. Male against female violence most likely to end in court. So what that means is that the female has pressed charges against the man. That statement also does take into account like restraining orders. So it might not be that there's criminal charges brought against the male, but it still would be considered as ending in court because the restraining order had to be court granted. And women much more likely to report abuse than what men are as well. And again, we can get into all like the male socialization process and everything else that explains that, but it's just for women to report it. While it's difficult to do, there's a lot more ego in men to admit that they were being abused by a partner, especially a female partner, just the way that our society has kind of structured the sex roles. So here you can kind of see this, hit my mouse. So here you'd see the intimate partner violence by sex, females versus males. It is on a downward trend, which is fantastic to see. And for men, it's been pretty steady. It is slightly lower than what it was in '94. And yes, these data points are 10 years old. I will say it has continued this type of trend. I think women are just slightly above 5, and men are still flirting around kind of that 2-ish range down here. So that's great, right? And it's showing that people are becoming more and more educated on this. We're also seeing education in kind of what makes a healthy relationship. And so that's preventing a lot of the violence that we see. Now, again, we do have to have that healthy skepticism of, okay, we're seeing that downward trend, but is it truly not happening at this rate of decline? Or are we just seeing the reporting habits drop a little bit? So we're getting kind of this artificial plateau. And I can't say what it is. I really like to think that we as a society are starting to move away from intimate partner violence, from where it was before. But yeah, I mean, it very well could be. No, it's just the reporting is down, and so we're getting this artificial decline. So Dr. Lenore Walker, she is the one that actually wrote a book called The Battered Women, and studied it and identified the term battered women syndrome. She argued that there was a cycle of abuse. And so here's what the cycle looks like. Phase 1 is the tension building. So increased tension, anger, blaming, and arguing. Phase 2 is acute battering. So hitting, slapping, kicking, choking, a use of objects or weapons, sexual abuse, verbal threats, and abuse. And then phase 3 is the contrition stage or contrition stage. This is the calm stage. Partner may deny violence, say he or she was drunk, say he or she is sorry, and promise it will never happen again. And then it starts once more. Not saying that every single person who is ever the abuser in a relationship is going to continue abusing, but statistically speaking, it is very rare for the cycle to end. We typically do see multiple go-arounds until there's some sort of intervention. So whether that is police intervention, that the perpetrator is taken to jail and charged, whether that is psychological intervention, so they go see a therapist about anger issues or whatever it is, something has to kind of happen. Now, for some, they think if we add to the situation, that will make it better. So, children or pets or things like that. And typically that's not the case. Typically that actually um, amplifies what is happening, because if phase one is tension building, bringing in a pet or a child, it's going to create more tension in the relationship. And so it's just likely to actually increase the frequency. So when we look at this, then I always get asked in my face-to-face version of this class, like, okay, so why do people stay in abusive relationships? And what can I do to help somebody who's in one? And the why is extremely subjective, right? That it really depends on who that person is, and what's going on. Many of us think it'd be very easy if we found ourselves in an abusive relationship. Well, I would just leave, right? Like, why would I stay with somebody who is abusive to me and hurts me? And absolutely, looking from the outside, that's the way that all of us feel. And when we see people that are in abusive relationships, we think, well, why would you stay with him or her? Why wouldn't you just get out? The problem with that is most of the time, if somebody is an abuser, they are extremely manipulative and they are doing things that we don't really see or understand. So some red flags for relationships is, if, again, I'm just going to use the more common male perpetrator, female victim. So if the guy tells girlfriend, wife, well, I don't want you to work. I want you just to kind of, be a stay-at-home, wife, girlfriend, mom, whatever, um, and just kind of manage that. That alone is not necessarily like a bad thing. It's not an immediate sign of abuse, but it's one of the things that should start to pique some antennae, right? That, like, okay, it's a little bit strange. Um, if the male starts saying things like, I don't know why you always want to hang out with your friends, or I don't know why you always want to go to your family for holidays. They don't like me anyway. I don't want to be there. Why don't we just have just a you and I weekend, or you or I holiday? Again, that alone is not the sign, right? But these things taken into conjunction, what the person is trying to do, who's the abuser, is cut out cut off any outlets for the victim, right? That if you constantly ask somebody, hey, you want to go out tonight, and they say, well, no, I can't, so and so, or my boyfriend wants to hang out with me, or whatever it happens to be, eventually you're going to stop getting invited. And instead they're just like, okay, well, whenever you want to do something, just let me know. And that part will never come, and you start to kind of cut some of those ties. Same thing with family, that if you start to cut family ties, you start to do things that make the family argue amongst themselves, the victim probably is going to side with the abuser in this case, because they're going to feel like, well, the abuser understands me, all that stuff. Again, the abuse might not have happened yet. This is all kind of setting it up. And so when the abuse actually does begin, now it's a thing of, well, there's no escape, right? All ties have been cut. And so you are solely reliant on the perpetrator, especially if they have been the ones that have been making money. Odds are they're not allowing you to manage it, if you're the victim. And so you are reliant on them for just about everything. And so how do you get out of a situation that you feel like there is no outlets for me anymore? I have no financial means to my name because everything is in his name. He is, the one that brings home money. Um, Certainly, if there's children involved, that becomes also a topic that weighs on them. Right, so it's not just as simple as like just get out. There's a lot more happening, but behind the scenes, and most of it starts with manipulation, and it's trying to cut the person off from close relationships and make the victim feel like the only person that understands them is the abuser. And again, once that happens, then the cycle, it's very obvious, right? That, okay, there's an abuse. But then if the abuser, apologizes, starts to justify, I was really stressed at work, or, typically what we start to see is they will own up that it was them at first. And then the next time it's going to be something that the victim did. Like, yes, I'm really sorry that, I hit you. I promise never to do it again. However, you did leave dirty dishes in the sink, and you know how I feel about that when I come home, right? Stuff like that, that they start to place the blame onto the victim. And this all messes with the self-esteem. And so we do see a lot of verbal abuse, which is highlighted right here, play a role in how the cycle happens, that you make them feel like nobody's ever going to love them. You make them feel like they're unworthy. You make them feel as if they're less than. And, sometimes it's threats of, well, and in the modern age, what I've been seeing, well, I have those nude photos of you, and if you, leave me or break up with me, I want to send it to your parents, or, post it on social media, or whatever it happens to be, right? So now they're doing kind of sexual extortion as well. And sometimes it will be, if you don't give me nude photos, I'm going to abuse you, right? And so we have just this endless cycle of things that ultimately create more and more of a downward spiral. So characteristics of battered women, again, these are just kind of generalizations, not saying that every single battered woman has these, but intrusive recollections, meaning that memories just flood in, and intrusive, meaning that you don't want them to, but things will happen. And again, I've seen it where a woman who was in an abusive relationship starts a new relationship, and just little things will kind of bring back these terrible memories, and it will really damage the relationship that she's starting to have with the new person. um, One person, for instance, it was the way that her new boyfriend held her hand was very similar to the way that her abuser held her hand. And so, like, she just couldn't do that. And obviously, as the new significant other, that is something that you have to weigh on as well. So, building new relationships typically are difficult. High anxiety, just always a concern that the abuser is going to show up at different places, show up at employment, show up um, on social media, right? Like all these things that they're going to find them and do something. Avoidance behavior. This is both avoidance physically, so like avoiding going to physical places, as well as avoidance mentally, like I just don't want to talk about it. Disruptive relationships, again, kind of goes hand in hand a lot with all these other ones. Body image distortions, it's just kind of a regular of abusers to ridicule their victims' bodies. Again, it's to make them feel as if they're less than, so that way they stay with their abuser, or they increase the likelihood of staying with their abuser. Sexual intimacy issues, especially if part of the abuse is sexual abuse. Yeah, there's going to be long-term consequences, unfortunately, of that. And then hypervigilance, that you're always checking your surroundings, that you're making sure that you kind of know where exits are. If you hear loud voices, you kind of jump to the worst conclusion possible. That's hypervigilance. So characteristics of batterers, diverse group that's very difficult to categorize. When we get into profiling, you're going to see this pretty common, that we have these ideas and we have, these things that support, okay, this is what's likely to happen, but it doesn't mean that absolutely every single person that has done this is this. So jealousy, very big one. And again, it's not that somebody has experienced jealousy, right? It's a normal, common human characteristic. So it's not saying that if you've ever experienced jealousy, you're at a heightened rate risk to be an abuser, but it's, what are they getting jealous about, right? Like that is the big thing is that is it something that a normal person would be like, yeah, I'm pretty jealous of that, or is it something that's completely off the rails and kind of possessive? Fear of abandonment as well. This plays a role with the jealousy. Highly suspicious. Again, in kind of the modern sense, this would be like, are you demanding that your significant other let you see their phone? And again, like that's not going to be a healthy relationship the majority of the time. Is that if you can't trust your significant other to have, you know, conversations, whether that be via text or social media or phone calls, if you're old school or whatever it happens to be, um, without you being able to look and see what it is that they're doing, it's kind of a red flag. Impulsiveness, just not really thinking things through. And then a substance abuser is a factor that does add to it. And this can be any substance. It hasn't been well parceled out, but like alcohol is kind of the big obvious one, because also alcohol increases impulsivity in most cases. So yeah, those are just basic traits. Again, it's not well parceled out. We do see kind of battering being predictive of other things, though, which is giving us interesting light on big questions that we had. So we see that if somebody is perpetrating intimate partner violence, we're seeing that quality be in shooters, mass shooters at a high rate, especially school shooters, where that connection was not really well known or well spoken about, you know, 10, 15 years ago. We're seeing it time and time again pop up. And it's not necessarily that they're abusive against their significant other. It can be, you know, an immediate family member, brother, sister, parent that they've been abusive against. So, just some basic types of abusers. There's limited research on effectiveness of typology of intimate partner violence. So, this is still early stages. Don't know if it's actually worthwhile to have these type of abusers or not, or if they're even right. So, not going to talk about them yet because, again, I don't know if this actually a valid thing. We will talk about typologies when we get to profiling, and you'll see those typologies much more research. These are still early on, just trying to categorize so we can better study. But again, if they're actually going to break down this way, we don't know. Women who kill their partner. So this is interesting topic. It was actually my advisor's master's thesis was on women who kill their partners, and it's fascinating to see because it's one of the big ploys in Hollywood, and we feel like, well, yeah, absolutely, that, you know, if a woman is being abused constantly, that if they end up killing their partner, he or she deserved it. And legally, we have other issues going on. So it is self-defense, which means all the self-defense caveats come with that. So you have to show an imminent bodily harm, meaning that's happening right then. So it's not, I'm going to wait for him to fall asleep and I'll kill him then. Can't do self-defense at that point. That is going to be murder in the first degree. And you'll have to, you know, plead the case, but the jury will most likely have to convict because you planned out somebody's murder and you went through with it. Doesn't really matter about the stuff leading up to it because you are being charged with the crime that you committed. Reasonable and proportional force used. So again, it has to be something from the legal side of things that makes sense. If they are ultimately not able to kill you with what it is that they're currently doing, then you're going to have a hard time showing this. You know, if somebody gives a verbal threat of, all right, I'm going to start abusing you, hitting you, slapping you, whatever, and you grab a knife and stab them, is that reasonable and proportionate? And on the surface, no. But if there is this history, you might be able to convince the jury that no, that actually was right. That she felt like the next abuse is going to be so severe that it could potentially kill her. Then yes, we view that as reasonable and proportional. No reasonable avenue of escape existed, so there was no means to get away otherwise. This is another big one besides imminent bodily harm. But if the abuser is sleeping and gets killed, well, there's plenty of avenues of escape, so it's not going to fly in the courtroom. Jurors negatively inclined towards women who kill their partners. This means is that typically if a woman kills their partner, they're not winning the case. They will go to prison. Here is some research on that. It's from the 80s. It has not changed much. This was kind of the hallmark study, but you can see here, battered women syndrome as self-defense. In modern terms, we would look at intimate partner violence. And yeah, about 75% ultimately get convicted, 25% it works for. So criticisms, again, we don't use battered women syndrome because there's issues with it. Some people have argued we should do what's known as social agency framework, which is fine. But what we're seeing much more readily is this, right? So instead of developing a new syndrome, instead we're recognizing that individuals who are experiencing abuse, especially frequent abuse, ultimately have extreme trauma, and so PTSD fits here. And again, this is, 2013, it came out in the DSM-5, and there was certainly research happening beforehand. But when we look at how relatively new PTSD is in our understanding, it's a pretty big step to say, yes, we're seeing it here. So 4 distinct diagnostic behaviors, and so this would be stuff that you would have to show to somebody who was evaluating you if you did kill your significant other or you were pressing charges against them. But re-experiencing traumatic events, avoidance of stimuli associated with the event, negative cognitions and moods, and heightened arousal or hypervigilance. These are diagnostic criteria for PTSD. They're very general, as you can see, but that's because, again, we're understanding that PTSD is more so is more than just war, right? That's how we used to view it. And now we're understanding like, no, victimization can also have PTSD with it. So using PTSD rather than battered women syndrome has advantages. So we already have a diagnostics category and criteria in the DSM. So now you have, all right, just about anybody can be an expert witness and can testify for you that, yes, you were exhibiting PTSD. There are critics of it, just because nothing ever is in a vacuum. You're going to have opponents and proponents. So critics, some specific battering syndromes not captured by the more general category. So in this case, people would like to see a difference between PTSD and domestic violence or intimate partner violence to highlight these. Doors open to exploration of past traumas. So traumas that were not a result of being an abuse victim, but prior to that could also be funneled in. And how do we then figure out what's happening in the court? Unclear effectiveness if abuse victim does not meet PTSD criteria. So yeah, if they're not meeting these 4 things, but they're still a victim of abuse, how do we handle that in the court? And not clear if the diagnosis of PTSD should be replaced. Battered woman syndrome in the courtroom is, again, one of the criticisms. We're seeing it already. Like I said, battered woman syndrome not widely used anymore. These are for expert testimonies. Just real quick, level 1, testimony on victim behaviors described by the defense as unusual and would describe myths held by the jury. So this is what your job is if you're an expert witness to try to kind of argue for. And it's not great. Your job as an expert witness, even though you typically are paid to do so, is to report what is factually known. And so playing on myths held by jurors, probably not the best thing to do for an expert witness. I've seen it happen, and it's frustrating, to say the least. But we call that level 1. Level 2, testimony on common victim reactions and general criteria. So this one, yeah, you're just out there to inform the jury and the judge about what is happening when we talk about PTSD, or rape trauma syndrome, because again, I have seen that used a little bit more recently, but we're seeing PTSD and rapes as well. Testimony that victim's behavior or symptoms are consistent. Testimony that the victim suffers from PTSD. Testimony that speaks to the ultimate issue. So the victim was sexually assaulted, or the victim was abused by so and so. So again, just some things that for anybody that's planning to become an expert witness, for these cases. So it means that you're planning to become a counselor or clinician or a social worker. These would be the different levels that you would be asked to hit on. All right, so that's the battered woman syndrome. The sexual violence one, I'm going to run through quicker. And I've done my best to try to shorten this up because, again, this is my main research. So I know I can go on and on about it. So we're going to do our best not to. So sexual violence against women, 85%. And again, this is an estimated number, so just always keep that in mind. Of all rapes or attempted rapes are acquaintance rapes, meaning that the victim knows the perpetrator. This goes against the old school thinking of stranger danger. Stranger danger just does not pan out. It just doesn't. It's a fear tactic at best. And again, there's, historically speaking, there's a reason for that. But yes, it's people that are the ones that are much more likely to do it. Studies have shown that when women, and again, men can be the victims of sexual violence as well, but women are, have much more target demographic. They may not label it as rape. They typically will try to justify it out as far as, well, we were, both drinking, or just misread signals, or whatever it happens to be. I wanted to stop, but ultimately I don't think he heard me, right? They start to rationalize it more. And again, same thing happens with men that are victims of sexual assault. College women's definitions: forced intercourse with an acquaintance or a stranger, being molested as a child, if drunk, drugged, or assaulted by boyfriend, less likely to label it as rape. And so this is from a survey that was done in 2013, I believe, as far as how college women define rape. And so yes, if drunk, drugged, or assaulted, they weren't as ready to call that rape. So part of this can be due to sexual scripts. So traditional female role is to resist the males of sexual advances. Traditional male role is to be persistent. We see this played up in Hollywood all the time, that you have the, dorky guy that ultimately just keeps on trying and eventually wins the heart of the woman. In real life, we call that stalking. Don't do that. Don't show up and try to give gifts to people. No, it's illegal. But again, we play off these scripts that men just need to keep being persistent. Eventually, the woman that they're trying to get to have sex with them, we'll see how great they are, and just no, right? But it plays off these traditional roles. So another study, this one sad, almost 100% of high school students agree a man should stop sexual advance as soon as a woman says no, but half of those students believe that when a woman says no, she doesn't always mean no. So this is also that double side of information that historically has been there. Now things have gotten better on this regard, based upon research and just, honestly anecdotal evidence, as far as um, being better educated about what um, consent actually is, and all that stuff. But again, this study I think was done in 2011 or 12, and just the fact that even then we were seeing half the students say when a woman says no, she doesn't always mean it. It's problematic. So here, just ultimately, this is getting into self-defense stuff that a student once asked me about, so I just put in the revised code of Washington. But for online, we're just going to leave it. Male sex role socialization, generally speaking, men are taught to be dominant and aggressive. This ultimately are characteristics that we see with serial rapists as well. Now, again, it's not saying that if a male is hypermasculine or is dominant or aggressive, that they will become a rapist. That is obviously not true, but it's a pattern. And again, that's what profilers are looking for, is what patterns do we see that are consistent, that we can start to limit down what suspects might be. Association between rape and pornography remains controversial. A number of studies have linked violent pornography and sexual arousal to rape depictions, violent sexual fantasies, rape callousness, and women abuse. So what this means is that there is no shortage of pornography out there. And I want to say in 2018 or 2019, there is actually a study done that showed just the exponential increase of violence against women in pornography. So it was staged or, acted out, I guess, as, a rape scene, or being tied up and, begging and things like that, that should not be sexually arousing. But what we know with pornography as of right now, is that for people who view a lot of pornography, it's typically that they don't view the same thing time and time again. They branch out, and eventually they branch out into the more violent or hardcore stuff, and that's where we see these things happen. Now, again, that alone is not going to say that they're likely to become a rapist, but it is one of the things that, again, we see as a commonality amongst serial rapists is, yes, they are very involved in pornography, or I shouldn't say involved, they're probably not creating it, but they have a lot of pornographic material, and most of it begins to sway into violent aspects of it. Alcohol abuse, I don't think we really need to talk much about this, other than the fact that I have it on here somewhere. Yeah, here we go. Media's labeled drugs such as Rohypnol, which is roofies, as a date rape drug. However, alcohol is the number one date rape drug, which again is just kind of an interesting tidbit that we hear a lot about, watching your drinks, and it's not bad advice by any means, but at the end of the day, the drink itself is the thing that we see used more often than any type of substance, any other substance type, I should say. Just more on alcohol abuse, that yes, under the influence of alcohol, we also see rape ideology increased, and also the likelihood of rape increased. All right, so personality characteristics. So this is self-reported college rapists. So keep that in mind, right? That these individuals are people who have said, yes, I have committed rape. Now, in research, we typically don't just ask that bluntly. Instead, what we do is we ask things that we feel are a little bit more socially acceptable, such as, have you ever gotten a girl intoxicated and then had sex with her, right? It's rape because if you're intoxicated, you cannot give consent, which means it was rape. But people are willing to probably acknowledge, like, oh yeah, sure, I brought a girl to a party and got her drunk, and then we went back to my place and had sex. Like, just speak of it very common a fact. But no, that is absolutely sexual assault. So that's where or how we get self-reported college rapists. So lack of empathy, so difficulty understanding other people's situations. We typically see a hostile masculinity. So again, masculinity in its own right is not a bad thing. It's also not a necessary thing as well. Like, there's certainly more feminine male men, and that's fine. The hostility part is the part that is problematic, right? That when you are so aggressively masculine, right? That the idea of another guy even making a joke about your sexuality causes you to want to lash out or attack them. That's where, yeah, that's kind of over the top. Macho slash aggressive and dominant and controlling personalities. So again, you'll see some similarities with abusers as well, the controlling aspect there. Impulsivity, we saw that with abusers. Emotional constriction, meaning that somebody's not really willing to open up fully emotionally. Underlying anger and power issues with women. So we actually now have a group known as incels, which are involuntary celibates, that have been making news cycles periodically. And if you ever go into any of these groups, you will see this major um, misogynistic viewpoint that they have. And they believe women are beneath them. Not saying that it's only incels. We certainly have other individuals that wouldn't be labeled or wouldn't call themselves an incel that have power issues with women. But yes, we definitely see this happening frequently. So, characteristics of sexually aggressive men: narcissistic, so they think that they are the greatest thing ever. Inability to empathize with women. Um, feel hostility and contempt towards women. Sense of entitlement, misperceive women's behavior. So we'll kind of lump all of these together. Um, I was not the expert witness for this case, but I was pretty close to the case as far as developing strategy and everything else. And I'll never forget that while I was sitting there listening to the defendant's statement, um, he argued that absolutely, I know that she wanted to have sex because she was wearing high heels at the club. And that has always stuck with me because you know, I'm married, and I asked my wife, like, have you ever said, all right, I'm gonna wear high heels with the intent of having sex tonight? And she's like, no, I don't know. And it's just one of those things that I'm like, how warped in your mind do you have to think that somebody's choice of footwear is ultimately the thing that is signaling that they want to engage in that activity? But we see it all the time. While they wore, that low cut dress to provoke me, right? So they're teasing me, or they're doing whatever it happens to be, and you know, sometimes could it be, I suppose, but many times it's just because they feel good in that. Sense of entitlement also plays, well, she's going on a third date with me and I've paid for dinner, all three times. So yeah, we're gonna have sex tonight. They owe me. Feel hostility and contempt towards women, and kind of goes back to the other one, but just think women are beneath them. And then the inability to empathize with women. We see this quite often, with a woman that says, well, yeah, I don't really feel comfortable walking at night alone or whatever it is, and just unable to understand why that might be, is again a characteristic. Again, not saying that if anybody has any one of these traits or even all of them that they are in fact a rapist, just we would profile them to be more likely to commit that crime. All right, so mental illness is, as far as, does that explain why somebody would rape somebody else? No, the majority of perpetrators, there's no mental illness that's there. This is coming from RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. And the following statistics and infographics will also come from RAINN. And so again, just to illustrate me trying to make this as objective as possible, RAINN is an organization that receives money as well as gives out money based upon rape, abuse, and incest happening. And so it's not that the organization is rooting for these things by any means, but certainly if they report certain statistics, it is important to know what's the purpose of that. And so just one of those things, RAINN typically does have different estimates than what I've seen published elsewhere. But again, that's just it. They're estimates. So RAINNs are typically kind of much more liberal estimates as far as what's happening. I've certainly seen more conservative estimates, which I'll highlight when we get there. So here, this is an infographic from RAINN that says about 3% of rapists will spend a single day in prison. The other 97% will walk free. And again, is this true? Maybe. It's important to try to dissect all this stuff out. But when we look at this number, right, 46% get reported to police. So right off the bat, 54%, if they don't get reported, they're not going to be arrested, which means, yes, they would in fact walk free. I'm not a big fan of the term walk free as it's highlighted here, because that does have the connotation that they went to court. But again, 54 would not have, using their data. That's an estimate. Again, they're saying that we only know about 46% of the rapes that get reported based upon a statistical algorithm. I've seen much more conservative estimates say that we know about 75 to 80% of the rapes that get reported, and it's only 20 to 25% that we don't know about. And so again, quite the range. It's interesting. I chose to include this mainly because of what happens next, because we do see this happen quite a bit, that we will get things like somebody get arrested. Ultimately, the evidence doesn't really hold up because rape is a very hard crime to try. And so instead they do a plea deal, and the plea deal ultimately doesn't have any jail time, but they're on the sex offender registry and they're on probation, something along those lines. Here, just another graphic that you can certainly look at on your own time if you wish. Again, important to note that this may or may not be more accurate. This is saying that about 0.3% are falsely accused. This was just a big thing during the Me Too movement that I always would get questions about. Are there false reports of rape? And yes, there are. The likelihood of that happening, this is definitely on the much lower end. I've seen estimates between 0.3% up to 7%. And so even at the 7% one, it still is a very low percent thing from happening, but it does mean that yes, it does happen. But it was just one of the big concerns that I came across, is people being concerned of being falsely accused of sexual assault. And again, it happens, but at the worst case that I could possibly find, it was 7% of all sexual assault claims are false, and best case that I could find was 0.3%. This is a little bit outdated information just for the state of Washington, but I thought it would be kind of interesting for people to see. Rape in the law, it is confusing because every state has their own terminology. So, rape, sexual abuse, sexual assault, they have different meanings in different jurisdictions. And so what you might have heard about, the state might not actually even have. Term consent is defined differently in different states as well. This is typically age of consent, but certainly when we look up what does consent mean, it might be written down differently in each state. So all this means that we have a very difficult time actually tracking this crime because it's listed and labeled differently in every single state. We also run into having a weird cut point, I think, in 2013, because the FBI changed the definition federally for what rape or sexual assault is. Where before the definition would not allow men to be rape victims because it talked about vaginal penetration. Now it has changed to where, yes, now men can be classified as being a rape victim from a federal level. So, history of rape in the law, again, just to understand where we come from and just to, get straight to the point. You can certainly read through this all if you want. But the old school idea of it was a woman's sexuality was owned by her father and then transferred to the man who became her husband. If a woman was raped, and this would be, again, 19th century, even up to the 20th century in some areas, it was not a crime against the woman. It was a crime against either her father or her husband. So she would not have even been allowed to state her case because she wouldn't have played a part in the legal side of it because she was viewed as property instead of a person, which again goes back to the domestic stuff as well, or the intimate partner violence stuff as well. So yes, the woman who is a victim of rape back then would not have had any say in what happened next. And again, it's important to recognize this because this is how our laws started, and we never really just create a new one, we alter them. We also have rape of, can a married couple experience rape? And yes, absolutely. That because you say I do, it does not mean that you lost the right to say yes or no, right? You still have all of your rights to consent to sex or not, regardless of your sexual history with that person. And then statutory rape, it's one of the things that is brought up a lot in mainstream. But again, it's one of those things that most states don't actually have a statutory rape law. In the state of Washington, we don't have a crime titled statutory rape. Instead, we have things that have to do with minors as part of the law. So sexual intercourse with a minor, there's indecent something, I'm blanking on the term right now, with a minor. And this website, which I'll try to show. No, I might have closed out of it. Nope, I didn't. Other browser. So this website that's linked there gives you a really nice summary. Here's all the different states, talks about what statutory rape is. Washington actually has a fairly in-depth one compared to others, which could be good, could be bad. But yeah, just kind of an interesting thing to look at least in my opinion. All right. So with that, much longer video, trying to put the two together. But if you have any questions about any of this stuff, please do not hesitate to let me know.